After a moment or two, I mustered up the courage to look through the small window in the door, and that's when I heard the creepiest sound I've ever heard. I'm Tom Stewart, and this is my paranormal story. Before I start this episode, I want to thank my good friends Scott Higgins and Ace Aceto for once again letting me co-host their podcast Behind the Funny for the month of October, or as we like to call it, Scottober. Every year they let me join them for a month of spooky paranormal interviews, and we had some great ones this year. We got to speak to Dustin Parry of Ghost Hunters, Cody and Satori, the paranormal couple, Ken DaCosta from Rise Up Paranormal, and others. Just please check out their podcast, wherever you get podcasts. We had a lot of fun in October, and they have a lot of great episodes. It's called Behind the Funny. Look for it. I also want to thank my old friend Scott Carney for having me on his podcast in October. Scott and I used to work together when we were much younger, and when I heard that he had a podcast, I insisted that he have me on so that we could talk about old times and maybe, a few of my paranormal experiences. And we had a blast catching up. I think you'll really enjoy the episode. So check out Scott's podcast, also wherever you get podcasts. It's called Carney Saves the World. And if you'd like to invite me to be on your podcast, please send me an email at myparanormalstorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also email me with questions, comments, or if you want, you can tell me your paranormal story. I always reply back. Now, here's my latest episode. I've never been the type of person to turn down an opportunity to check out a spooky place. The spookier, the better. And that's exactly what happened one fall afternoon some years ago. It was probably around 2006, 2007. My friend Izzy was planning an afternoon trip somewhere out in central Massachusetts to look for spooky locations to take pictures. And she asked me to come along. Izzy, short for Isabella, and I first met at a nightclub we both worked at in Providence, Rhode Island. And back in those days, I was a club DJ, and Izzy was a bartender, and we bonded over many things. Our love of music, our love of scary movies. She was also a big fan of everything paranormal, just like me. And I even took her on a few investigations back in the day, which she loved. I don't know if it's just me, but except for maybe one or two, most of my friends are people I've met in the workplace. Like, some of them have even become like family to me. I find it interesting how close we can become to someone just from working with them. I suppose there's sort of a bond you make when you're both in the trenches of whatever job it is you do, and you're stuck together for hours at a time, getting to know each other along the way. I guess that's why lots of romances and even marriages come from the workplace. Now, Izzy and I, we never dated or anything like that, but we've always been friends. But I suppose that's a form of love, too. Another passion Izzy and I share is I've always loved taking pictures. Looking at that perfect scene, trying to capture it on camera. For a few years, I was really into it. I would take pictures everywhere I went, especially rock concerts. So back then, before camera phones, you had to smuggle in a small camera to get some good shots. And I thought concerts were one of the best places for photographs. I loved capturing the bands and their special effects on stage, but I especially liked taking pictures of the people in the audience. There's just something about the innocence of thousands of people coming together in peace to hear their favorite band play their favorite songs. I remember one time I took a picture of this guy. He was a few seats down from me. He was facing forward towards the stage, and he had his young son sitting up on his shoulders. and he and his son were both throwing devil horns up in the air, as many people do at rock concerts. At the time, I never thought much of the photo, but Izzy would say that it was my best picture ever. And when I think about it now, I guess it was a pretty cool photo. I wish I could have found out who that guy was and given him a copy of that picture. But even as cool as that photo might have been, none of my photos have ever been as good as Izzy's. She's got such an eye for finding the most picturesque, mysterious pictures. At least once a week, she would trek off somewhere where most people never go to take pictures. Abandoned buildings or old mills, creepy cemeteries, dark forests. I don't know what she was looking for, but her pictures would always be amazing. She would capture things like fog and shadows just right, like scenes from some morbid book of poetry. And she told me I could use one of them for the cover of my book if I ever finish writing it. Anyway, one day, Izzy asked me to come spend the afternoon with her taking pictures at an old abandoned quarry somewhere in central Massachusetts, and I didn't hesitate. Like I said, I love spooky places. Plus, I knew anytime you take a trip with Izzy, it's going to be an adventure. We jumped into her old beat-up hatchback and drove off to who knows where. It was at least a 2-hour drive. I honestly don't even know what town we were in. Most of the ride was through back roads and wooded areas. I just assumed she knew where we were going. And eventually, we pulled into an old, small, dirt parking lot next to a park. I think it was a small forest, because it was just trees everywhere. And it was kind of a cool, cloudy fall day. What little sun there was quickly faded as we headed down this wide dirt path into the woods. We'd be walking and talking, and every few minutes I'd find myself walking and talking to myself, because Izzy kept stopping to turn and take pictures of things that she would see out of the corner of her eye. Like an old tree stump or some branches sticking out of a bush. Maybe a fallen tree leaning up against another one. She just found all of these things so interesting, and it all came out so beautifully in her pictures. As we continued down the path, it started getting spookier. At least to me, anyway. The daylight from the parking lot was behind us now, and the canopy of trees above us made it feel like we were in some sort of evil place, like something out of Lord of the Rings. I kept hearing strange sounds from all around us, twigs snapping or branches creaking. But it was the whistling sounds that kept stopping me in my tracks. Every few minutes or so, there would be this weird whistling sound coming from what seemed like all different directions. Now, Izzy said it was just birds, but I was expecting someone or something to jump out at us. Izzy just kept on snapping her pictures as we continued into the woods for what seemed like a while, until finally we reached a large chain-link fence with a padlocked gate. End of the line, I figured. Whatever was on the other side of this was forbidden. But of course, that was exactly where Izzy wanted to go. We climbed over the fence and continued down the path. After a few minutes, we came upon an old rock quarry. At least, it looked pretty old to me. Clearly, no one had been working there for a long time. It was just this huge hole in the ground with small dugout ramps that spiraled around the sides, and this wide open space that just went from one side to the other as far as your eye could see. This large pit was surrounded by dilapidated work trailers and storage sheds. And Izzy was like a kid at a playground. She wanted to take pictures of every building, inside and out. And before I knew it, we were trekking down one of those hills, heading deeper into the stone pit. I could hear the wind above us howling as it blew over the top of the quarry, and bits of stone and sand were trickling down the sides. I couldn't help but wonder if this was safe. But I was also curious as to what we might find on the way down. And Izzy, of course, would stop every few minutes to take pictures of things above us, below us, all around us. But it got more and more eerie the further down we went. We got about halfway down the spiraling ramp when we saw a door embedded into the side of the wall. It was an old metal door with lots of rust and peeling paint, and it had a small window with the glass broken out of it. As soon as I saw it, I knew Izzy was going to take pictures of it. And sure enough, she did. After about 12 or so shots from different angles, that's when she decided to open the door. I assumed it was just going to be an old storage area, but it looked more like a tunnel of some kind. She looked at me, and I could tell by looking into her eyes that she wanted to go in. I pulled out the small flashlight I keep on my keychain and followed her through the doorway. It was a small passageway that just went straight into the bedrock. Maybe about 6 feet tall and just wide enough for two people to walk side by side. And it was dusty and cold, but completely carved out of the stone on all four sides. I'm not sure what this could have been used for, but we slowly kept walking down this tunnel with only my small flashlight to guide us. We could just about see 5 or 6 feet in front of us, and that's when I started to realize that the walls all around us were completely bare. No light fixtures, no wires, and no graffiti. I always find abandoned places troubling when there's no graffiti on the walls. The whole time, all we could hear were the echoes of our footsteps as we shuffled along. And this whole time, Izzy hadn't taken one picture. I'm not sure if she was scared or distracted or if she just wasn't seeing anything worth shooting. Then, after a few more minutes, we spotted something off in the distance. It was an old wooden chair, just leaning up against the right side of the tunnel. It was just sitting there by itself, up against the wall. We stopped and stared at it for a moment or two. I fully expected Izzy to photograph it, but she didn't. So I decided to. I crouched down to take a few shots from eye level, and that's when we heard another whistling sound. It was just a quick. I couldn't tell if it was coming from behind us or in front of us. But I looked at Izzy and said, "You still think that's a bird?" At this point, we decided to go a bit further into the tunnel. It was already going to be a long walk back, and I thought maybe this path was going to lead to an exit back into the woods. And sure enough, we found ourselves at the end, in front of another metal door. It looked just like the first one, but with less rust and less peeling paint. And the glass was still in the small window, but it was too cloudy from dirt and dust to see through it. I pulled on the handle to try and open it, but the door wouldn't budge. Izzy grabbed on too, and we both pulled as hard as we could, and it just wouldn't open. Just then, we heard a strange thud come from the other side, like something metal had fallen to the ground. We both jumped back and stood there frozen. After a moment or two, I mustered up the courage to look through the small window. I wiped off as much dirt on the glass as I could with my sleeve, but it was still hard to see through. But I could tell it was a small room, much bigger than the small corridor we'd been walking down. I tried to shine my flashlight through the glass to try and light up the room, and from what I could tell, it was empty. No furniture, no fixtures, nothing. And that's when I heard one of the scariest sounds I've ever heard. First, it sounded like an old man grunting in frustration. But then, there was this creepy, scraping sound like I've never heard before. We both turned and started running back towards the other end of the tunnel. We quickly passed by the old wooden chair and just kept on running towards that front door. And that scraping sound continued behind us. And it wasn't fading. It was as if the sound was keeping up with us. We finally got to the other end, and the door at the entrance was closed. But I was not about to stop and find out what it was chasing us. Without hardly slowing down, I threw my shoulder into that door and it quickly flung open. With our eyes adjusting to the daylight again, we jogged up that spiraling ramp all the way up to the top of the quarry again. We stopped to catch our breath as we stared down at the door, hoping nothing would be coming out after us. We quickly turned and made our way back towards the chain link fence and down the wooded path towards Izzy's car. When we finally got inside, we locked the doors. But before driving away, we decided to look at some of the pictures we took. As I swiped through the pictures on my digital camera, most of them weren't anything special, but then I got to the one of the wooden chair in the tunnel. As soon as it appeared on the screen, Izzy jumped back. We were both shocked at what we saw. I swear, it looked like the shadow of a man sitting on that chair. The hairs on my neck are going up right now just talking about it. It was crazy. Now, usually at this point of my podcast, I would tell you to go to my webpage and look at the picture for yourself. I always love posting evidence for you guys to see whenever I can. But later that night, after our adventure at the quarry, I took out my camera to look at the picture again, and it was gone. More than half of my pictures were missing. They got deleted somehow. For years, Izzy and I used to talk about that day and that picture. But sadly, just like that picture, Izzy is gone too. She passed away a couple of years ago from cancer, and I miss her. I miss our little photography adventures, and I don't take pictures as much as I used to anymore. But Izzy still lives on through her many photos, and if you want to see them, they're still on a website called Flickr. Just search for Izzy Shoots. My Paranormal Story is written, produced, and narrated by me, Tom Stewart. Music from this episode courtesy of Kevin MacLeod at Incomptech.com. If you enjoy my stories and would like to support the podcast, you can visit my website at myparanormalstory.com. You can click on the donate button, or if you want, I have t-shirts and coffee mugs for sale. Because unfortunately, podcasts cost money, and your support helps me keep this podcast running. Every little bit helps. You can also check out my book called The 10 Best Tools for Ghost Hunting. If you ever wanted to learn more about the gadgets used in paranormal investigation, you can check it out on Audible, Kindle, or Amazon.com. Please help my podcast grow by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends on social media. And feel free to follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Just search for My Paranormal Story. If you have a podcast and you'd like me to be a guest, or if you'd like to ask me a question or tell me your paranormal story, you can email me at myparanormalstorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Tom Stewart, and this is My Paranormal Story.